There is something quietly extraordinary about the night sky on a clear winter evening. Not a city sky, not the pale, washed-out dome that most of us sleep under, but a genuine, unobstructed darkness, the kind you only find far from roads and light and the ordinary hum of modern life. On a night like that, when the cold is real and the stars are sharp and the silence has actual weight, it is possible to feel something very old stir at the edge of your awareness, a kind of recognition, a pull toward the fire that is not metaphorical, something in the body that remembers without being able to say what it remembers, that the dark was once a much more serious thing. That feeling has a history. It has a name in a way, though no one who lived it ever wrote it down. It belongs to a world that existed before writing, before cities, before the slow and comfortable accumulation of everything that stands between a human body and the weather. It belongs to the Ice Age not as a concept, not as a chapter in a textbook, not as the setting for a movie with animated mammoths, but as a lived reality, a daily condition, the actual texture of what it meant to be alive on this planet for the vast majority of human history. Tonight, that is where we are going. Not as tourists and not in any hurry. We are going to settle into that world, its cold, its dark, its extraordinary demands, and try to understand what it actually felt like to be one of the people who survived it. Because they did survive it, against odds that are almost impossible to hold in the mind in conditions that would end most modern lives within days. For tens of thousands of years, human beings persisted. They raised children, they made art, they buried their dead, they looked up at the same stars and felt something that across the impossible distance of 50 or 60,000 years we might still recognize. That is the story. It is a long one, and it is a real one, and it is worth taking slowly. Before we go any further, if this kind of history is what you've been searching for, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling reach the people who need it. And if you feel moved to drop a comment, where are you listening from tonight and what brought you to this particular story, I always want to know. Now settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let us begin. The last ice age, what scientists call the late Pleistocene glaciation, the great cold that shaped the world our species was born into, was not a single event. It was not a freeze that came one winter and stayed. It was something far slower and stranger than that. It was a rhythm, a long grinding oscillation of the planet's climate that lasted in various forms for close to 100,000 years, with the ice advancing and retreating in pulses that played out over millennia, each one reshaping the land, the sea, the living world, and the small, stubborn populations of human beings trying to navigate it all. At its most extreme, roughly 22,000 years ago, ice sheets reached as far south as what is now the middle of the British Isles, and covered nearly all of Scandinavia under a weight of frozen water several kilometers thick. Sea levels were lower by more than 100 meters, which means that vast stretches of coastline that are now submerged were then dry land, inhabited land places where people lived and hunted and built their fires. The English Channel did not exist. A land bridge connected Britain to the European continent. What is now the North Sea was a broad, cold plain, and in parts of Southeast Asia, the islands of what would become Indonesia and the Philippines were joined to the mainland in a single landmass that archaeologists call Sunderland. The world's geography was genuinely different. The map that exists in every classroom is a map of the aftermath, not the event. And into all of this, into a world of ice and cold grassland and enormous unpredictable animals and skies that were darker and wilder than anything most of us will ever see human beings walked. They had been walking for a very long time. The migrations that carried our species out of Africa and across the surface of the planet began at least 60,000 years ago, possibly earlier, and by the time the ice reached its greatest extent, people were living on every habitable continent. They were in Europe, huddled in the river valleys of what is now France and Spain and Germany. They were in Siberia in temperatures that should have been unsurvivable hunting animals in landscapes of almost total desolation. They were in Australia, where they had arrived by boat or raft across open water at least 50,000 years before the present. They were in the Americas, having crossed the land bridge from northeastern Asia that the low sea levels had exposed, filtering southward through a corridor in the ice into a hemisphere that no human eye had ever seen before. These were not primitive people in the sense we sometimes imagine, not shuffling stooped figures half a step removed from the animals around them. The evidence tells a different story, and it tells it with quiet insistence. These were people with language, almost certainly because the cognitive architecture that produces language was already ancient by this point in our evolution. They had social structures complex enough to coordinate large-scale hunts and to maintain the kind of intergroup relationships that allowed knowledge and material and occasionally people to move across vast distances. They had art, not crude scratches on a wall, but paintings of breathtaking sophistication rendered in ochre and charcoal and manganese, deep inside the caves of what is now southern France and northern Spain, images of horses and aurochs and rhinoceroses that were made by firelight, by someone who had looked at these animals with genuine attention and found a way to make that attention permanent. The cave at Chauvet in the Ardèche Valley of France contains paintings that have been dated to more than 36,000 years ago. They are not the work of a species finding its feet. They are the work of people who are fully, completely recognizably human, and yet the world they lived in would be unrecognizable to us in almost every practical sense. The cold was not an inconvenience. It was a structural fact of existence as constant and as fundamental as gravity. In the worst periods, temperatures in Central Europe were 12 to 15 degrees centigrade lower than they are today. That is not a small difference. It is the difference between a landscape of forest and field and a landscape of open steppe and frozen tundra, swept by winds off the ice sheets to the north, grazed by animals adapted to conditions of extreme exposure and offering precious little natural shelter to any creature that could not build its own. The people who lived in these conditions understood cold in a way that has no modern equivalent. They understood it the way a sailor understands the sea, not as a backdrop, not as weather, but as the primary force that organized everything else. Where you camped, what you ate, how you moved, when you moved, how you made your clothing, how you kept your fear, what you did when the fuel ran out. All of it was downstream of the cold. All of it was an answer to the same ancient pressing question: how do we stay warm enough to survive the night and then the next night and then the winter that stretches ahead for months without a break? We are going to spend a long time in that world tonight. We are going to look closely at who these people were and what they knew and what they faced. We are going to read the evidence, the bones and the tools and the ancient deoxyribonucleic acid and the art with as much honesty as the record allows. And we are going to sit with the places where the record goes quiet, where scholarship still debates, and the picture remains incomplete because that honesty is part of what this kind of history owes to the people it is about. There is something waiting in the next part of this story that changes the scale of everything. Something about what the cold ultimately did not over decades, but over generations, over millennia to the size of the human world. The numbers when you encounter them are quietly stunning. Somewhere beneath the North Sea, under roughly 40 meters of cold grey water, there is a landscape that no living person has ever walked across. It has valleys. It has riverbeds, old ones, carved by rivers that ran for thousands of years before the water rose and swallowed them. It has what appear to be the remnants of lakeshore environments, places where sediment and organic material accumulated in the still shallow water at the edge of ancient lakes. The kind of places where people tend to settle when the living is possible, where fish can be taken and birds are plentiful, and the ground near the water stays soft enough to work. Archaeologists have a name for this drowned country. They call it Dogger Land after the Dogger Bank, the shallow ridge that was once its highest ground. And what the sediment cores and sonar mapping of that submerged landscape reveal is not an empty wilderness. It was, by all available evidence, one of the most productive and heavily populated regions in all of Ice Age Europe, a broad river-threaded lowland that connected Britain to the continent and supported human life for thousands of years before the rising seas of the post-glacial period finally claimed it somewhere around 8,000 years ago. It went under gradually over centuries, not in a single catastrophic flood, though there may have been episodes of sudden inundation driven by the collapse of ice dams in the North Atlantic. Mostly it was the slow, patient work of water. A few centimetres a year, coastlines retreating islands, forming where there had been hills, the old paths between hunting grounds becoming shallower, and then impassable, and then simply gone. The people who lived through it would have experienced it across generations rather than lifetimes. Their grandparents had crossed certain ground on foot. Their grandchildren would need boats. What was lost was not just land. It was an entire geography of memory, the places where families had camped for centuries, the routes that connected communities, the mental map of a world that was season by season being slowly erased. Doggerland is one piece of a much larger picture, and that picture is one of the genuinely underappreciated truths about the Ice Age world that the planet our Pleistocene ancestors inhabited was in its coastal and lowland geography radically different from the one we know. The sea level difference, more than 100 meters lower at the glacial maximum, meant that continental shelves which are now underwater were then exposed land, and in many cases they were the most habitable land available, sheltered from the worst of the interior cold, rich in marine and riverine resources, positioned at the intersections of migration routes. The people most likely to have survived and thrived during the harshest periods were precisely the people who lived in these coastal and lowland zones, and precisely those zones are the ones now buried under the ocean, which means that the archaeological record we are working from is in a very real sense incomplete by definition. The evidence that survives on land is the evidence of people who lived in the harder places. The easier places are gone. This is not a minor caveat. It reshapes how we think about Ice Age population, Ice Age culture, and Ice Age innovation. Scholars still debate the extent to which the disappearance of coastal habitation zones distorts our picture of Pleistocene human life, but the consensus is moving toward acknowledging that the distortion is significant. When geneticists analyze ancient deoxyribonucleic acid from Ice Age remains and find patterns of population structure that suggest extensive inter-regional contact, and exchange those contact routes may have run largely through lowland and coastal corridors that no longer exist. The connections between the people of what is now southern Europe and the people of what is now the Middle East may have been maintained not primarily through mountain passes, but through the broad, now submerged plains of the Mediterranean basin, where sea levels were lower and the crossing distances shorter. The world was more connected and connected differently than the surviving evidence alone would suggest. What the land-based record does preserve is extraordinary enough. The cold steppe environments of Europe and northern Asia during the glacial maximum, what paleontologists call the mammoth steppe, a biome that no longer exists anywhere on Earth, were among the most ecologically productive grasslands the planet has ever supported. That seems counterintuitive. Cold, windy, largely treeless, swept by weather systems rolling off the ice sheets to the north. It does not sound like a rich environment. But the key is the grass. Cold, dry conditions produce dense, nutritious, ground-level vegetation sedges, and grasses and herbs that stay low against the wind and concentrate their energy in their roots against the winter, and that support in their abundance enormous herds of large grazing animals. Woolly mammoths, of course, but also woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, wild horses in numbers that are difficult to imagine now, reindeer moving in seasonal migrations that stretched across hundreds of kilometers, cave lions and hyenas and wolves following the herds. The mammoth steppe was, in terms of sheer biomass per square kilometre, comparable to the great African savannas. It was a world of large animals, and human beings were hunters within it. The relationship between Ice Age people and the mammoth steppe megafauna is one of the central stories of the Pleistocene, and it is considerably more nuanced than the image of spear-wielding hunters chasing terrified animals across an open plain. The evidence from kill sites and camp middens, the accumulated refuse of meals and tool-making and ordinary life, suggests that Ice Age hunters were deeply knowledgeable naturalists, people who understood animal behavior with the kind of granular experiential precision that comes from spending an entire life outdoors in direct dependence on the living world around them. They knew migration routes, they knew seasonal patterns of movement and congregation, they positioned themselves at natural bottlenecks, river crossings, cliff edges, narrow valley mouths, where large animals could be driven or intercepted, and they made tools of astonishing specificity, spear points shaped differently for different prey, hafted with resins and plant fibre in ways that required both skill and planning, designed not just to penetrate but to remain in the wound and cause the animal to weaken as it moved. The mammoth in particular occupied a role in Ice Age life that went far beyond meat. The bones of mammoths were used as structural elements in some of the most elaborate dwellings yet found from the Pleistocene. Circular structures built on the open Ukrainian steppe, far from any cave, using mammoth skulls as foundation anchors and long-limb bones as roof supports, covered presumably with hides to create insulated living spaces in a landscape with almost no natural shelter. Some of these bone-circle structures at sites like Mezhyrich and Mezin appear to have been used repeatedly over long periods, suggesting they were not casual overnight camps, but something more like semi-permanent seasonal bases, returned to year after year by groups who knew the land and planned their movements across it with care. The evidence remains incomplete, and reconstruction of how these structures actually looked and functioned involves a degree of informed inference. But they speak clearly to one thing: the people who built them were not improvising. They were applying accumulated knowledge in a systematic way, and they'd been doing so for generations. What is harder to recover, and what the physical record can only gesture towards never fully restore, is the inner life of these communities, the knowledge systems, the ways of teaching and learning, the stories told around fires that have been cold for 20,000 years. Here the evidence goes quiet in a particular way because the most important things human beings transmit to each other, the names of places and the rules of kinship, the maps of the sky, the explanations for why the world is the way it is, leave almost no physical trace. What survives is the durable and the accidental stone, bone, ivory, ochre. What does not survive is language music, the content of dreams, the words spoken over the dead. And yet, the art survives. Not all of it, not most of it probably. Pigment on limestone endures under the right conditions, but pigment on wood and bark and hide and skin is gone forever, and we have no way of knowing how much was made on perishable surfaces that left nothing behind. But what has been found in the caves of Europe, in the rock shelters of southern Africa, in the engraved bones of Siberian sites, is enough to make the inner life of these people feel close and real in a way that the stone tools alone cannot quite achieve. 40,000 years ago, someone chose to press their hand against a cave wall, blow pigment around it, and leave a negative image of a living hand in the dark. That hand is still there. The gesture is still legible. Whatever it meant to the person who made it, it meant enough to make. The people, their tools, their dwellings, their animals, their art, these are the materials of the story. But materials are not the same as the story itself. What gave shape to all of it, what organised every choice about where to go and when and how, was something far older and colder and more fundamental than any of them. Every human being alive today carries somewhere in the chemistry of their cells a record of the Ice Age. Not a metaphor, not a poetic approximation, a literal molecular inheritance patterns written into the genome by the pressures of cold and scarcity and isolation that shaped the populations of the Pleistocene over thousands of generations, the way certain bodies process vitamin D, the way certain immune systems respond to cold weather pathogens, the distribution of blood types across modern populations which follows with quiet fidelity the ancient migration routes of people who moved through Ice Age landscapes long before any of those landscapes had names. The Ice Age did not end when the glaciers retreated. In certain fundamental ways it is still present in the biology of every person listening to this. That is the scale of what we're talking about, not a distant curiosity, not a chapter that closes cleanly and leaves the subsequent chapters unaffected. The Pleistocene is the period in which the human species was essentially formed, not in some crude deterministic sense, but in the sense that the selection pressures of that long cold epoch, the demands it placed on cognition and cooperation and physical endurance shaped the kind of animal we became. We are in a very real and specific way Ice Age survivors, all of us. The question is what that actually required of the people who lived it directly without the insulation of agricultural cities or the accumulated infrastructure of 10,000 years of civilization. The answer begins with the migration, because the people of the Ice Age were above almost everything else people who moved. The sedentary life, the life attached to a particular field, a particular house, a particular address, is an invention of the agricultural period and a relatively recent one. The populations of the Pleistocene were mobile in a way that is genuinely difficult for a modern mind to inhabit. Not restless, not disorganized, not wandering at random, but structured in their movement following the rhythms of the animals they hunted and the plants they gathered, returning to certain places in certain seasons with the same regularity that a modern person might return to the same chair in the same room. The landscape was a calendar. The migration of reindeer herds northward in spring was a clock. The ripening of certain plant foods in certain valleys was a date on a schedule that existed entirely in human memory, passed from one generation to the next through teaching and story and the accumulated experience of knowing a particular piece of ground over a lifetime. The genetic evidence for these movements is in some respects more detailed than the archaeological evidence, because ancient deoxyribonucleic acid survives in bone and tooth enamel under the right conditions, and can be extracted and sequenced in ways that reveal population relationships with remarkable precision. What that evidence shows in broad outline is a human world of considerable complexity by the time the ice reached its maximum extent. There were not simply undifferentiated bands of hunters spreading evenly across the landscape. There were distinct genetic lineages, regional populations that had been separated long enough to diverge measurably from each other, and then episodes of contact and mixture that left their signatures in the genome as clearly as a fingerprint. There were populations in Europe during the glacial maximum that appear to have been almost completely isolated. The people sometimes called the Gravettian culture, whose range extended from what is now France across Central Europe and into the Russian plain, show a genetic profile that suggests long periods of limited contact with the populations of the Near East to their south and east. And then when the climate shifted, those barriers broke down and the mixing began again. Scholars still debate the degree to which these genetic boundaries corresponded to cultural and linguistic ones, whether the people on either side of a particular mountain range or river system thought of themselves as different from one another, had different stories and different beliefs and different rules for how life should be organized. The physical record cannot answer that question directly. What it can show is that material culture, the styles of tool-making, the particular shapes of projectile points and bone needles and carved figures, does follow genetic boundaries to a degree that suggests some meaningful connection between population and tradition. The Gravettian tool tradition, which flourished across a broad arc of Europe and Western Asia roughly 32,000 to 22,000 years ago, is defined by a set of characteristic stoneworking techniques that appear and disappear across the archaeological record in ways that track the movement and contraction of those populations through the worst of the cold. Among the things the Gravettian people left behind are the Venus figurines, small carved objects mostly in ivory and soft stone, and occasionally fired clay depicting female bodies in a style that emphasizes certain anatomical features with a consistency that is too deliberate to be accidental. They have been found across an enormous geographic range from the Atlantic coast of France to the Don River in what is now Russia, which means the tradition of making them, or at least the shared understanding of what they were for and how they should look, moved with people across thousands of kilometers of Ice Age landscape. The most famous of them, the Venus of Willendorf, carved from Oolitic limestone and found in Austria in 1908, is small enough to fit in a closed fist and painted with red ochre that has partially survived. She is roughly 30,000 years old. What she meant to the person who made her, what she was for what she represented, whether she was a fertility symbol or a teaching object or a portrait or something for which we have no modern category at all, the evidence does not say. Scholars have been arguing about it for more than a century, and the honest answer is that we do not know. What we do know is that she was made with care by someone who had a clear idea of what they wanted to make and the technical skill to make it. She was not a casual object. The existence of these figurines across such a wide geographic range points to something that is easy to understate. The Ice Age world, for all its hardship and its distances, was not a world of isolated, disconnected groups living in ignorance of each other. There was exchange, not constant, not easy, not without the enormous friction of distance and terrain and seasonal impassability, but real exchange of materials and ideas and probably people. Shells from the Mediterranean have been found at Ice Age sites hundreds of kilometers inland, which means either that people were travelling those distances or that objects were passing from group to group along chains of contact and trade that linked coastal populations to interior ones. Amber from the Baltic coast turns up at sites in Central Europe. Particular types of flint whose geological sources can be identified with precision moved across distances that required either long-range travel or a network of intermediaries stretching across the landscape. What this tells us is that Ice Age people had something that required maintenance relationships. Not just within the immediate group, the band of perhaps 20 to 50 people who moved and camped and ate together on a daily basis, but between groups across the wider social landscape of a region. Those relationships had to be cultivated. They required meetings, which means they required places designated for meeting and times designated for meeting, and presumably the protocols and ceremonies and gift exchanges that make meetings between groups possible without violence. The large aggregation sites found at certain locations in the archaeological record, places where the debris of many different groups appears together in quantities suggesting periodic large gatherings rather than continuous occupation, point to exactly this kind of structured intergroup sociality. People came together, they exchanged things, they almost certainly exchanged people, marriage partners, most likely because small isolated groups that do not exchange marriage partners across several generations face the biological consequences of close inbreeding, and the Ice Age populations were too successful for too long to have made that mistake repeatedly. The physical demands of the life were by any modern measure extraordinary. Studies of Ice Age skeletal remains, and the sample is not large because bone preservation over 30 or 40,000 years is difficult under most conditions, show patterns of stress and wear that speak to a life of sustained heavy physical activity beginning in childhood. The bones of Ice Age adults show muscle attachment sites enlarged by decades of repetitive loading, the kind of pattern seen today only in competitive athletes or people doing sustained manual labour. The joints show wear, the spines show compression. These were people who carried heavy things long distances, who pulled and hauled and processed carcasses and worked hides and gathered fuel in quantities that had to be maintained constantly against the cold. The evidence remains incomplete, and reading the biography of a life from skeletal remains requires interpretive care that responsible researchers apply cautiously. But the general picture is consistent. This was a physically demanding existence, and the bodies that survived it were built to absorb demands that modern bodies by and large are never asked to meet. And yet those same bodies, those worn joints and thickened muscle attachments, belonged to people who painted horses by firelight with pigments they had ground and prepared with deliberate care, who carved small figures from ivory with flint tools of extraordinary precision, who maintained the social networks that kept their communities alive through winters that lasted longer than most modern people can easily imagine. The hardship and the artistry were not separate things. They came from the same people in the same lifetimes, in the same firelit caves and open-air camps on the edge of the ice. What is waiting just ahead in this story is the moment when all of that endurance was tested in a way that had no precedent. The cold in a particular period did something that no human population had yet survived. And the fact that we are here to tell the story is in itself one of the more remarkable things about it. To keep a fire alive through an Ice Age winter is not simply a matter of having fuel. Anyone who has spent real time outdoors in genuine cold, not the cold of a chilly morning walk, but the deep structural cold of a world without central heating or emergency services, or the knowledge that warmth is always just a short distance away, will tell you that fire management in those conditions is closer to a relationship than a task. It demands attention. It demands knowledge of what burns and how, of how to read the quality of wood by touch and weight, before committing it to the flame, of how to bank coals against a long night so that morning does not begin with the catastrophic work of starting again from nothing. Fire is not a tool in the ordinary sense. It is a partner. And in the Ice Age, it was the partner on which everything else depended. The evidence for Ice Age fire use is ancient and widespread, and it tells a story that is more complex than the simple image of a person crouching over a spark. Controlled fire use in the human lineage stretches back at least 400,000 years, possibly closer to 1 million, long before our species in its modern form existed. By the time of the last glacial maximum, fire management was not a new skill. It was a deep inheritance refined over hundreds of thousands of years of necessity, and the people who carried it through the Pleistocene had access to a body of practical knowledge about combustion and fuel and heat management that most people today could not replicate in any reasonable time frame regardless of their general intelligence. The knowledge was in the hands. It was in the nose, which can distinguish useful resin-rich wood from wood that burns fast and leaves nothing. It was in the body's learned understanding of how a particular kind of hearth holds heat differently from another kind. What Ice Age people were doing with fire goes considerably beyond warmth, though warmth was foundational. Fire was light in a world of genuine darkness, not the ambient darkness of a modern night, which is rarely true dark, but the absolute darkness of a cave interior or a winter night, far from any other human settlement where the absence of light is complete and the psychological weight of that absence is real. Fire was a tool for working materials heating pitch to use as an adhesive for hafting stone points to wooden or bone shafts, a technique that requires sustained controlled temperature rather than simply a flame, and that produces a joint strong enough to withstand the impact of a spear striking a large animal at close range. Fire was used in the preparation of food, obviously, and the caloric implications of cooking are not trivial. Cooked food yields significantly more energy per unit than raw food, because heat breaks down the cellular structures that the digestive system would otherwise have to work through, which matters enormously when caloric intake is uncertain and energy expenditure is high. And fire may have been used in the processing of stone itself. Certain types of flint and chert, when heated and cooled in a controlled way, become more workable, their fracture properties improving in ways that allow finer and more precise knapping. The evidence for deliberate heat treatment of stone tools appears in the archaeological record as far back as 160,000 years ago in southern Africa, long before the last glacial maximum, suggesting that the relationship between fire and technology was already old and already sophisticated by the time the Great Cold reached its peak. Consider for a moment what it means to possess this kind of knowledge without writing. Everything just described, the properties of different woods, the technique of pitch preparation, the heat treatment of stone, the management of coals through a long night, had to be carried entirely in human memory, transmitted from one generation to the next through teaching and demonstration and practice. There were no manuals, there were no reference texts, there was no way to look something up if the person who knew it died before passing it on. This places a very specific kind of pressure on the social structure of Ice Age groups. The people who carried knowledge were irreplaceable in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from the vantage point of a world in which almost everything knowable is written down somewhere. The loss of a single experienced elder, someone who knew the migration routes, who knew which plants were edible in which seasons, who knew the technique for preparing birch bark tar, was not just a personal loss. It was a deletion from the collective memory of the group, and in bad conditions it could be a deletion that cost lives. This is one reason why the social structures of Ice Age communities, insofar as the evidence allows us to reconstruct them, appear to have placed significant value on age and experience. Burial evidence from the Pleistocene, and it must be said that formal burial, the deliberate interment of the dead with goods and ochre, and what appears to be some form of ceremony, is itself a marker of cognitive and social complexity. Includes some individuals who appear from their skeletal wear and their healed injuries to have been quite old by the standards of a world without medicine. People with severe arthritis, people with healed fractures that would have left them with limited mobility for the rest of their lives. People who in the grimly practical calculus of survival could not have carried their own weight in the most literal sense, and who were apparently kept alive and cared for by the group around them. The evidence remains incomplete, and we should be careful about overreading intention from skeletal data, but the pattern is suggestive of something that feels across the enormous distance of time deeply familiar, the deliberate maintenance of older, more experienced members of the community not as a burden, but as a resource. Among the more quietly remarkable details in the Ice Age record is the evidence for clothing, not the clothing itself, which has not survived, but the tools used to make it. Eyed needles carved from bone and ivory begin appearing in the European archaeological record around 45,000 years ago, and they are small, genuinely small, some only a few centimeters in length, with eyes drilled by a tool so fine that the technique required to produce them is itself a matter of archaeological study. A needle that size is not for rough work. It is for close, tight stitching, the kind that produces a garment with seams sealed against wind and water. The kind of stitching that the people of the Arctic and subarctic have used for centuries to make clothing that actually keeps a person alive in extreme cold. Modern experiments in cold weather survival have demonstrated repeatedly that the difference between a loosely assembled hide and a carefully tailored, layered garment is not a matter of comfort. It is a matter of hours. In temperatures below -20 degrees centigrade, a poorly made garment can mean death within a day. The existence of fine bone needles in the Ice Age record is, among other things, evidence of a tailoring tradition sophisticated enough to make survival in the coldest periods genuinely possible. What did that clothing look like? Here, the evidence goes quiet in the way that perishable materials always do, and scholars still debate the details, drawing partly on the ethnographic record of Arctic peoples whose material conditions offer an imperfect but illuminating parallel. The most widely accepted reconstruction holds that Ice Age garments were multi-layered, combining an inner layer worn with the fur against the skin for insulation and an outer layer worn fur outward for wind resistance, with separate pieces for the torso, legs and head, all stitched together with sinew thread. Some researchers have argued that the Venus figurines with their carefully rendered surface textures may preserve partial evidence of garment styles, that what looks like a belt or a band on certain figures represents actual clothing rather than decoration. It is an intriguing possibility, and it is the kind of interpretive question that the evidence alone cannot fully resolve. The shelter question is equally rich and equally incomplete. Caves are the most visible evidence because stone survives, and the occupation deposits inside cave sites preserve an astonishing record of daily life. The ashes of hearths, the scattered remains of meals, the flint-knapping debris, the broken and discarded tools that accumulate over generations of use. But caves were not available everywhere, and even where they existed, they were not always the most desirable option. A cave with a good southern exposure and a reliable spring nearby was a resource to be competed for, not a guaranteed home. The open-air sites, the mammoth bone structures of the Ukrainian steppe, the post-hole patterns of wooden structures found at some Western European sites, the windbreaks and lean-tos that leave only the faintest trace in the soil, represent a tradition of construction that was entirely independent of natural shelter, and that speaks to the same fundamental capacity for planning and material intelligence that the tools and the art reflect. How a person builds a shelter in deep cold is a question of knowledge before it is a question of materials. The materials bonewood, hide stone are available in most Ice Age landscapes to anyone who knows how to find and process them. What is not available without teaching is the understanding of how to combine them in ways that actually work, how to orient an entrance to minimize wind penetration, how to insulate a floor against ground cold, which can be as dangerous as air cold, how to manage ventilation so that a sealed interior stays breathable while remaining warm. These are not insights that anyone arrives at quickly by trial and error, in extreme conditions, because in extreme conditions the price of the wrong trial is death. They are insights accumulated slowly across generations, tested and refined and passed on as carefully as any other form of wealth. And that transmission, that patient, unwritten, irreplaceable transfer of knowledge from the people who knew to the people who needed to learn, was perhaps the most important technology the Ice Age world produced. More important in the end than the needle or the hearth or the hafted spear. The knowledge of how to survive was the survival. What that knowledge looked like when it was tested at its absolute limit, when the cold deepened past anything that preparation could fully meet, is a story with numbers in it that are difficult to sit with quietly. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, aerial illustration of the submerged North Sea plain rendered beneath stylized grey-blue water, ancient river channels and lake shores sketched as ghostly lines below the surface coastlines of Britain and Europe visible at the edges. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, underwater sediment, cross-section illustration showing ancient organic layers as dark bands within pale silt, a stylized scientific diagram with aged parchment warmth depth suggested by graduated tone, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of Doggerland as it appeared during the Ice Age, a broad flat plain threaded with rivers, shallow lakes glinting in low light marsh grasses along the water edges, a group of figures moving along a riverbank in the distance, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist, ancient landscape, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, person with light skin and thick wavy hair standing at a former shoreline, now at the water's edge looking out across a grey shallow sea that covers what was once dryland wind, in the hair expression quietly reflective, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor. Texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, family group of people with varied features and light skin seated beside a slow river, afternoon light on the water, children close to adults, one elder with short white hair watching the current. The whole scene unhurried and gentle, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, illustrated world map, showing Ice Age sea levels with exposed continental shelves, coloured in warm sand tones, submerged zones in pale blue land bridges, visible connecting continents rendered on aged parchment without text, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of the mammoth steppe in early winter, dense low grass and sedge, stretching to every horizon, a herd of woolly mammoths in the far middle ground, dark shapes moving slowly left pale cold sky above, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of a woolly mammoth, rendered from the side high domed shoulder, long curved tusks, guard hairs hanging in a skirt around the belly, the animal drawn with careful naturalistic attention and quiet reverence. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted, earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, cave lion, crouching on a limestone ledge above a river, muscular and still larger than a modern lion. Amber eyes in the dusk light a landscape of cold steppe stretching behind it to the horizon. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, group of hunters with light skin and varied facial features positioned at a natural valley, bottleneck crouching low, watching a herd approach from the right, postures focused and still the readiness of experience. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, ice age working site on open tundra, a large dark animal form at center, several figures working around it, methodically with stone tools, steam rising in the cold air, flat pale sky overhead, the work calm and practiced, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close, detail of a bone being cracked for marrow on a flat stone, a rounded hammerstone held in a light, skinned hand, raised above the split bone, showing the pale interior firelight from the left side. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide circular mammoth bone-dwelling structure on open step, mammoth skulls forming the base long limb bones as supports, hide stretched over the frame, a fire at the entrance surrounding plain dark and flat. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, interior of a mammoth, bone shelter at night, curved rib bones forming the walls, two figures with different hair lengths seated near a central hearth, the space close and warm, hide walls glowing amber in firelight. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, woman with light skin and two thick braids constructing a fire in a shallow stone ring, her hands placing split wood carefully over the coals, morning light, low breath, faintly visible, focused and efficient. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close, detail of pine resin being heated over flame in a small stone vessel, the amber liquid warming and softening a spear tip held nearby, ready for hafting the process, shown with quiet technical care. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, man with light skin and straight shoulder-length hair, demonstrating spear thrower technique to a younger person, watching intently, the teacher's posture deliberate and patient, open, tundra behind them. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of an ice age gathering. Site debris of many groups present several fires in a loose arrangement, people with varied facial features and hair moving between groups, a rare coming together of a larger community. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of a Mediterranean shell resting on a stone surface hundreds of kilometers from its coast of origin, still catching light rendered with the quiet wonder of an object that has travelled impossibly far. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, piece of translucent amber resting on a dark cloth, warm orange glow, a small insect visible inside the object far from its Baltic source, suggesting long chains of human connection across the Ice Age world. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, person with light skin and loosely coiled dark hair, crouching over a specific type of flint outcrop, testing the stone with a finger, assessing quality with the practiced attention of someone who knows this material intimately. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide migration route illustration, across a simplified landscape, groups of small figures following river valleys, southward, dotted lines suggesting seasonal back and forth movement. The whole scene calm and purposeful. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, woman with light skin and short wispy grey hair, seated outside a shelter entrance in morning light, mending a garment with practiced hands. Children playing quietly behind her, the scene domestic and peaceful. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of sinew thread being prepared, a figure with light skin splitting and twisting, dried animal tendon between fingers, the thread fine and strong laid out in neat lengths on a flat stone. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide landscape of a dried continental shelf now submerged, the former terrain visible as ghostly contours beneath shallow water suggested by pale blue watercolour wash over a detailed topographic sketch. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, Ice Age people with varied features resting at midday in a shallow valley, some sleeping, one figure with light skin and long reddish hair sitting upright watching the tree line, a mood of guarded rest. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of a young child's hands being guided by adult hands to shape a small clay figure. Three hands together, the child's expression absorbed and delighted, firelight warm on both faces. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide evening landscape of an ice age region, water glinting in the last light, a camp on the ridge above, fires being lit, one by one against the coming dark, the world at rest. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, person with light skin and dark close-cropped hair, studying the night sky, arm raised pointing at a cluster of stars, a younger figure beside them tilting their head upward, the gesture of teaching something ancient. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close view of a reindeer herd crossing a shallow river. At dawn, the animal's close-packed antlers moving above the mist, the crossing slow and determined, pale light on the water behind them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, small group of figures gathered outside a rock shelter. At dusk, one person with light skin and silver-streaked hair, gesturing broadly as they speak, others seated, listening, the fire between them newly lit. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted, earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of the Ice Age. Landscape at its most expansive, the mammoth steppe under a heavy sky, a thin line of figures in the far distance following a river southward, the scale of the world immense around them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide overhead, view of a frozen river valley at night. Several fires glowing in the darkness like small warm stars below the Ice Age world, stretching away in every direction, still and immense. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of ancient preserved plant material in Ice Age, permafrost, sedge grass and small wildflower petals still visible after thousands of years, rendered with this delicate scientific warmth on aged paper. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of a waterlogged site as it appeared during the Ice Age, a small camp at the edge of a lake in winter, wooden structures, visible plant material gathered nearby, a sense of rare and fragile preservation. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, Closest detail of a deoxyribonucleic acid. Double helix rendered in warm ink on aged parchment, soft scientific illustration style. Faint annotation lines at the margins, the structure, elegant and contemplative, suggesting deep inheritance. Hand-drawn ink illustration. Watercolor. Texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft, atmospheric haze. Minimalist, ancient landscape, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, schematic illustration of ancient human migration routes spreading out of Africa across the world, flowing amber lines on a simplified globe. Populations branching into Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, rendered on warm-aged paper, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of an Ice Age landscape with a small mobile group of people in the middle, distance, their movement unhurried and purposeful, following a river, valley southward, the landscape calendar visible in the seasonal vegetation around them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines. Woman with light skin and long loose dark hair, standing at the edge of a spring migration, watching a reindeer herd moving northward across a wide valley. Expression, calm and ease, and knowing her body, still as the herd passes. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor, texture, muted earthy tone, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, elder with light skin and white braided hair, teaching a young person to read animal tracks into soft mud, both crouching the elder's finger, tracing a hoof impression gently, morning light, low and golden behind them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, closest detail of an ancient genetic lineage map on aged parchment, branching lines showing population relationships across Europe rendered as a warm tree diagram without text, contemplative and unhurried. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of a Gravettian cultural range across Europe. A simplified illustrated map showing the distribution of similar tool-making traditions from the Atlantic to the Russian plain, warm amber land tones. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of a small Venus figurine, resting in an open palm, rounded ivory form, worn smooth by handling traces of red ochre in the carved lines, the figurine ancient and precisely made fingers curled gently around it. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist, ancient landscape, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, person with light skin and tightly coiled short hair, carving a small figurine from ivory by torchlight flint tool. In one hand, the emerging form cradled in the other, absolute concentration in the face. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture muted, earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide illustrated distribution map of Venus, figurines across Europe and Western Asia, small icons marking find locations from the Atlantic to the Don River, the spread suggesting a shared tradition across enormous distance. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, ancient human skeleton laid carefully in pale soil, red ochre dusted across the bones, grave goods arranged with clear intention viewed from above in a clean archaeological illustration age parchment background. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, man with light skin and loose shoulder-length hair sitting beside a person who cannot walk, offering food and tending a fire for them. The caregiver's posture attentive and patient, firelight warm between them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of a healed bone fracture and cross-section illustration, smooth callous growth over the break visible aged paper background, delicate annotation lines, a quiet reminder of care and recovery in a difficult world. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide landscape of limestone hills during the Ice Age, forested slopes above open ground, cave mouths visible in the cliff face, a small group of figures approaching across a meadow. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of the lion man figurine, carved from mammoth ivory, human body with feline head, the surface polished by of years of handling displayed against dark background with warm side light. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, figure with light skin and short silver hair holding a small carved object close to a torch, flame examining its surface with focused eyes, the object catching the light, its meaning private and ancient. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of an intergroup meeting on an open plain, two communities of people with varied facial features and light skin gathered around a shared fire, gifts laid out between them, postures open and ceremonial. Hand-drawn ink illustration, Watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of an engraved bone fragment, regular fine marks in rows across its surface, a magnifying view suggesting the marks are systematic and intentional, age parchment illustration, scientific and warm, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, person with light skin and loosely braided auburn hair, studying the moon from a rock shelf at night, one arm raised toward it, the lunar surface clearly visible above a bone with marks in the other hand. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide landscape of the periglacial zone, just south of the ice sheet open, permafrost plain under a flat grey sky, a few mammoths moving through the far middle ground, the scale of the cold visible in the emptiness. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, ice age skeletal remains, illustrated with care on aged paper, the bones robust and thick muscle attachments, markings visible, a scientific illustration that communicates both strength and the passage of time. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, young person with light skin and tightly coiled dark hair, practicing throwing a spear on an open plain, an adult with different facial features watching and adjusting the stance, afternoon light warm behind them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of a stone tool hafted with resin and sinew, binding the joint strong and precise, the spear point aligned, the whole object laid across two hands for inspection, firelight warm on the finished work. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, woman with light skin and medium wavy hair, seated outside a cave entrance in winter, sunlight, nursing a child expression, peaceful and tired, mountains visible in the background, the scene completely human. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of a seasonal gathering site. Many figures from multiple groups gathered in a broad valley, fires lit across a wide area, the rare abundance of a large community visible in the scale of the gathering. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of a young couple with light skin and different hair textures walking side by side along a river path, the relaxed ease of their posture suggesting belonging to the same group, the landscape open around them. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide night landscape of the Ice Age world, a scatter of camps, visible as tiny fires across a dark plain, the distance between them emphasizing both the isolation and the connection of these communities. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor. Texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, person with light skin and short dark hair, painting red ochre onto their own hand before pressing it to a cave wall. The gesture deliberate, the expression inward and serious. The torchlight catching the ochre. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close view of multiple hand stencils on a cave wall, different sizes suggesting different ages, some overlapping made across generations, the limestone ancient and layered, the hand still readable and present. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style storybook art. Soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of the world just before the last glacial maximum. The ice pressing southward on the northern edge of the frame, a green-brown corridor of survivable tundra below small figures moving within it purposefully. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, elder with light skin and close-cropped white hair, examining a young child's injured arm with care. The child's face calm and trusting. Others in the background, watching firelight steady the tent interior close and warm. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, Ice Age woman with light skin and wavy dark hair, carrying a large bundle of firewood across snow toward a camp, her breath heavy, posture weary but steady, smoke from the campfires ahead guiding her. Hand-drawn ink illustration watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines close. Detail of wild plant foods gathered and laid out on a flat rock, roots, seeds, dried berries, each identified and separated by a practiced hand, a record of the knowledge required to eat safely in an Ice Age landscape. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide landscape showing the glacial refugia of southern France and Spain, warm green valleys between limestone hills, Winter sun low, but present a place where the thread of human survival held small and stubborn. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines. A solitary figure with light skin, standing at the edge of an ice age plain, in the last light of day, looking north toward the distant white line of the ice, the world ahead cold and enormous and survivable. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, person with light skin and thick dark hair, crouching beside a hearth in deep cold arranging, split wood over coals with practiced care, firelight on the face breath, visible the fire, a living partnership in the dark. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of different types of firewood arranged beside a stone hearth, a hand with light skin, testing the weight and texture of a piece, the knowledge of fuel quality carried in the body, warm side lighting. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide interior of a cave used as a winter shelter, hearth at the center, still glowing from banked coals, several sleeping figures under hides, the space intimate and protected cold air visible at the entrance behind. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close view of a person with light skin and short auburn hair, carefully banking fire coals for the night, covering them with ash to preserve the heat, a small learned ritual performed with quiet attention before sleep. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, ancient fire-making scene, two hands pressing a wooden spindle into a hearthboard, smoke beginning to rise from the friction point, the absolute concentration of someone for whom this skill is survival itself. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide timeline illustration of controlled fire use, in the human lineage rendered as a horizontal line on aged parchment stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, simple icons marking key moments, no text. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, figure with light skin and loosely braided grey hair, roasting food over coals, the steam and smell of cooking implied in the image, another figure waiting nearby the scene, domestic and necessary and warm. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close, detail of pitch being heated over a small fire, the amber liquid bubbling gently in a stone cup, a spear tip held at the ready beside it, the whole operation deliberate and technically careful. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, person with light skin and wavy shoulder-length hair, heating a flint nodule carefully over controlled fire coals, the stone changing colour as it warms, the process of heat treatment shown with patient technical attention. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of an Ice Age camp at night from above, multiple small fires in a loose arrangement, each with a small group of figures, pathways of light connecting them, the dark tundra vast and surrounding. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, elder woman with light skin and white hair, bound up loosely seated before a group of children in firelight, her hands moving expressively as she speaks, the children's faces wrapped knowledge passing visibly between them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close, detail of a human hand, pressing a bone needle through thick hide, the stitch tight and even a length of sinew, following through the concentration of a person whose clothing will determine whether they survive the cold. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, Ice Age garment displayed from the front, inner fur layer and outer wind-resistant layer, visible at the seams, separate pieces for torso and legs, stitching detailed and purposeful, rendered as a museum illustration on age paper. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, man with light skin and thick black hair, wearing full-layered Ice Age clothing, standing in an outdoor winter landscape, the garment covering everything but the face, the engineering of warmth made visible. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of a bone needle beside a drilled ivory bead, both shown to scale on a flat stone, the needle eye visible. The bead hole precisely made the skill required for each object quietly remarkable. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, woman with light skin and reddish hair, examining a series of sewn seams on a finished garment, turning it slowly, checking each joint with experienced fingers. the inspection of someone who understands what failure means. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of a cave site with post-hole marks visible in the floor, an illustrated reconstruction suggesting a wooden structure built inside the cave entrance, firelight within tundra. Beyond, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, group of figures with varied features, constructing a lean-to shelter from branches and hides, one person lashing the frame with sinew, another stretching a hide over it, the work cooperative and practiced dusk behind them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close, detail of a shelter entrance, orientation relative to wind direction, illustrated on aged parchment as a bird's eye diagram, the practical geometry of survival visible in the placement, warmth preserved by design, not chance. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, interior cross-section, illustration of an Ice Age dwelling showing floor insulation, fire position, and hide roof. The diagram warm and detailed, suggesting accumulated knowledge of how to hold heat against the cold. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, person with light skin and short dark curly hair, sitting cross-legged inside a shelter arranging dried plant material on the floor for insulation. The work methodical and unhurried. Warm firelight from behind. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of open steppe in winter, the mammoth bone dwelling structures visible as dark circular forms on the plain, fires between them, the sky enormous and pale above. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, closer view of mammoth skull, serving as foundation anchor for a bone structure, the skull half buried, its curved form providing a base for the upright limb bones above, the engineering visible and surprisingly elegant. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, man with light skin and long silver-streaked hair, teaching a young person to read weather signs in the sky, both looking upward, the elder pointing to a cloud formation, the student's face serious and attentive. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary style, storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of birch bark tar being prepared over a controlled flame, the dark liquid forming slowly, a stick used to stir it. The patience of the process implied a figure with light skin, bent close, hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour. Texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, woman with light skin and loose wavy hair, passing a prepared spear to a man with a different face shape and shorter hair, the exchange between them practical and familiar, both standing outside a shelter entrance at dawn. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide landscape at first light, hunters with light skin and varied features moving silently across a snowy slope in single file, the valley below still in shadow, the approach practiced and quiet. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close detail of animal fat being rendered slowly over fire in a shallow stone vessel, the clarifying liquid yellow and rich, a light-skinned hand steady nearby, the caloric importance of fat visible in the care taken. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, Ice Age community after a successful hunt, people moving between tasks, some butchering, some tending children, some carrying materials, the whole scene organised and purposeful, late afternoon light, low and warm. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, closer view of a person with light skin and medium dark hair, carefully preserving meat by laying it over a smoky fire. The slices thin and even, the smoke rising steadily, a technique for extending survival through the lean months. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of a food storage cache being dug in frozen ground, two figures with light skin working together, one cutting, one lifting the permafrost, a natural refrigerator visible in the pale blue-grey soil layers. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, elder with light skin and white close-cropped hair, sitting beside a fire in winter, face lined and calm, one hand resting on a young person's shoulder, the transfer of something unspoken and essential between them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolour, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide view of an ice age, winter landscape at its most austere, flat, tundra plunged under a low white sky, no animals visible, a single thin smoke thread, the only sign of life, the cold absolute and real. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor, texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, close view of a child learning to bank fire coals under adult supervision, small hands guided carefully, the lesson given with patience, the fire dying down to a warm orange glow, the skill beginning to pass forward. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, minimalist ancient landscape, calm sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, wide night view of an ice age camp from a distance, fires glowing warm in the surrounding darkness, the cold world pressing in on every side, the knowledge inside the camp holding it back. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, a lone woolly mammoth standing on an open step at dusk, its high-domed shoulder silhouetted against a pale amber sky, hunters with light skin, watching from a low ridge in the distance, the megafauna world still vast and present. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, vast ice sheets pressing southward across a pale map of the northern world, a narrow corridor of survivable tundra. At the margin, a small group of figures with light skin, huddled around a fire in a deep valley, the cold at its absolute peak. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted, earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, an elder with light skin and white braided hair, tending to an injured person beside a steady fire. The community gathered close, the evidence of care and hardship held together in one quiet scene. The Ice Age camp still and human around them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, a figure with light skin raising a torch inside a deep cave chamber, painted animals covering the curved limestone walls in ochre and charcoal, the light catching the surface unevenly, the 30,000-year-old images alive in the moving flame. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines. Two different human groups with varied features meeting at the edge of a forest on an open plain. The encounter between them cautious and open, the genetic and cultural blending of the late Pleistocene implied in the space between them. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines, a post-glacial landscape in slow transformation, ice retreating at the northern horizon, birch forest advancing from the south, a figure with light skin standing at the threshold between the old world and the new, watching the change with still attention. Hand-drawn ink illustration, watercolor texture, muted, earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines. A modern person with light skin and loose dark hair, pressing a hand against a limestone cave wall beside an ancient painted stencil. The two gestures separated by 40,000 years. The continuity of the human impulse held in the single image, hand-drawn ink, illustration, watercolour texture, muted earthy tones, cinematic wide-shot vintage documentary-style storybook art, soft atmospheric haze, calm, sleepy mood, detailed sketch lines. The Gargas cave wall in stillness. A single-hand stencil in red pigment at the centre of the frame. 5 fingers clear against pale limestone. 1 finger slightly bent, the darkness total around it, the gesture complete and quietly permanent.